What is ESG and what is its link to the financial sector? We're about to find out. Welcome to the Social Impact Journal, episode 17. I'm Jack, your host. Today, I'll be talking with Alice Merry, who is a financial inclusion expert and founder of 3Fin Consulting. She's worked with international NGOs, UN agencies, and financial institutions all across the world. And she'll be here discussing with me today about the bridge between ESG and the financial sector. Here's a trailer.
My name's Alice Merry. I work in financial inclusion and sustainable finance topics. I started off working very much in mainstream finance in the insurance sector in London. And then I made this move towards more social and environmentally minded organizations. So I started working in the International Labour Organization and with others, NGOs that really have this social and environmental purpose. And a lot of the time, there's a huge disconnect between the financial sector and, civil society or organizations that want to create social environmental change. The timing that we have, especially if we think about the E of the ESG and the environmental issues, the amount of time we have left to make meaningful change is really, limited. And so, in the next 5 years, we need to see huge changes. And I hope that those come about. I hope that, we're going to look back in 5 years and say this was the time when these issues came about. And I think it's certainly possible. This can't all be led by the financial institutions. Actually, I believe we need government interventions, policy changes to force this to move more quickly, because there's really important initiatives are going on within the sector, but they're also responding to the environment around them. And really that needs to be pushed very much more quicker.
Hi, Alice. Good afternoon. How are things?
Hi, Jack. Very well, thank you. Great to be speaking with you.
Likewise. So before we get into the episode, maybe you can give an introduction to the audience of exactly what you do.
Sure, perfect. My name's Alice Merry. I work in financial inclusion and sustainable finance topics. I have a background working in mainstream finance and in international organizations in the United Nations. And then I set up the consulting firm, 3Fin Consulting.
Awesome. And I understand you live in Peru right now.
Yeah, I do. I live in Lima in Peru. So I'm from the UK originally, but I've been in Peru now for 8 years.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking, about ESG and the link between ESG and the financial sector. So before we get into this, what does ESG actually mean when broken down into each letter, and why is this important to the financial sector?
Yeah, so ESG, well, this stands for E as environmental, S for social, G for governance. So this is the policies, the standards, the approaches that a company or an organization might take to environmental, social, and governance issues. So, in terms of environmental, this might be how they think about their carbon footprint. How do they run the company in a way that has the least impact possible on the climate? Social, we're thinking about, issues of inclusion, issues of having a positive social impact on their employees, on their clients, on kind of everybody who comes into contact with the organization. And then governance, you're thinking about kind of, when you hear scandals about such and such a company is charging more and more, and yet the shareholders are getting bigger and bigger payouts, or such and such boss led with this bonus. These are the kind of like governance issues around pay, around how a company is run, around its structure and management and so on, that you would see under the G aspect of ESG.
Got it. Yeah, we always see different news stories coming out about different scandals. So in recent years, have you seen trends in terms of the topics within each letter within ESG? Are those topics rising? Are they actually expanding in terms of their breadth?
Yeah. Right, certainly. So something, if we start on the environmental side, that you see is a real taking more seriously of climate in general. So, how climate maybe started off so many years ago as more of a sort of fringe issue, or it's like an optional issue. Really now it's very mainstream. And then you see kind of a broadening of what companies and financial institutions are expected to and are thinking about. So it's not now only maybe a matter of climate change, they're also being expected to think about nature. What's their impact on nature? How are they using all of the resources that they might come into contact with? So there's a real broadening of the topics that companies are expected to really be up on, be able to report on, be able to talk about, and kind of a growing ambition coming from the side of NGOs and civil society, both that kind of increase ambition and broaden scope. And on the social side, you definitely, Jack and myself, we work a lot on this side of kind of financial inclusion, but you definitely see this emphasis on the fact that services which are, important and supportive of populations are often simply not available to low income and vulnerable populations. And how can financial services and others expand and make services more widely available? I think again there you see an increase of ambition and also a broadening of topics. So you might see more about gender identity within issues of inclusion and so on, whereas perhaps before it was a more simple idea of what inclusion might mean. So on both, I would say kind of increasing ambition and increasing scope sideways of what should be included.
Alice, you mentioned around the E point, the environment, and that the topics are really broadening in that area. I read a report recently about analysis of the FTSE 100 firms, and it was talking about their promises for net zero, and that the majority of firms were not actually, reporting their actionable steps and reaching there. So are you seeing a disconnect between the importance of obviously ESG reporting and sustainability towards actual what is happening in the financial sector today?
I mean, I think something that we've seen in the financial sector, but we've seen in the business sector, we've seen in politics, we've seen in government, is a sort of recognition of the importance of reaching net zero. Promises are being made, but there's not necessarily the plans in place or the reporting there to make sure that it's a reality. I think the challenge is enormous. The kind of changes that need to take place in all sectors of society, including the financial sector, are huge. And I'd certainly think that there can be a disconnect between the overriding aims we've seen, but then taking that down a level. What does that mean every single year, and how are we going to report on reaching that every year to get there? And so far, the evidence is pretty clear, not only in the financial sector and other sectors too, we are quite a long way off achieving net zero, which is not to say, of course, that it's not possible. There are really promising reports and roadmaps showing that it can still be done. But we need certainly more concrete actions and more concrete reporting to be able to make sure that we really get there.
Yeah, for sure. So I know a lot of your work is centered around this, and you mentioned at the start your role with Three Fin Consulting. So what exactly do you do at the consultancy, and what's the mission of that organization?
Yeah. So it reflects a little bit my own personal background, which is that I started off working very much in mainstream finance in the insurance sector in London. And then I made this move towards more social and environmentally minded organizations. So I started working in the International Labour Organization and with others, NGOs that really have this social and environmental purpose. And a lot of the time, there's a huge disconnect between the financial sector and civil society or organizations that want to create social environmental change. And Three Fin Consulting is really intended as a bridge between these two worlds. So we design campaigns, we create trainings, and we carry out research that helps people who want to bring about social environmental change translate those ambitions into something that makes sense for the financial sector and that the financial sector can work on, can act on. And vice versa. So it's really set up to be a bridge between those two things. And we focus in three areas that we see as really key to bringing about this kind of change, which is safeguarding nature, serving communities, and driving local economies. So that's sort of three areas where we really see that the financial sector has a huge role to play.
Awesome. And you mentioned around a message, about being able to translate that message into something
Yeah.
the financial industry understands. So what exactly do you mean by that? And what are the steps that are taken?
This is a huge challenge, and I think I've done work with different kinds of large global NGOs, as well as with kind of smaller national charities, and there's a big challenge in translating. It's not only a matter of language as well, in translating their messages and what they want to, the change that they want to bring about, into something that makes sense and is kind of usable with the financial sector. And partly this is a matter of language. There's certain language that NGOs might use that's very off-putting to the financial sector, and vice versa. Actually, somebody who works in an NGO once said to me, Alice, we do so much work to talk the financial sector's language. She felt they don't do the work to speak our language. So it's certainly it's a two-way thing for sure. But it's not only a matter of talking language, it's also a matter of identifying the exact change that you want to bring about. Because sometimes NGOs might have very ambitious and really important policy aims that they want to bring about, and they have to decide what part of that, or how ambitious do they want to call on the financial sector to be. So maybe I can give you an example. So if it is an environmental NGO's aim that a certain kind of energy, oil and gas, for example, is completely eradicated, and they want to be speaking with an insurer or a financial institution that's heavily invested, or their portfolio really is in the oil and gas sector, then what's their message? Because it might be for the financial institution, that's an existential threat that might be closing down their business. So is their message, which way do they take it? Do they say, okay, we're going to go and try and close down this business, say this should end? Or are we going to say, we see the worst of this business and we want you to be responsible for starting to refuse it? For example, coal. We don't want any more coal, but we're going to kind of leave the rest for now. So it's very strategic, it's very difficult, and it really touches on kind of existential questions, both for the NGO partner and for the financial sector partner.
Yeah, it's I mean, and obviously the language in the financial sector and the language in the NGO space is so distinct and tricky to understand. I think similar to yourself, I came from the financial space as well and into the international development world, and it took me a while to understand, the language. So I know you've done some work with the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, WWF, around this idea of messaging. So what exactly did you do there, and what was the results?
Yeah. So when I'm doing, a project like this, where you're working with an NGO and you want to speak with financial sector leaders, ideally you want to be having that conversation together. So how, you'd approach a project like that is you want to be having interviews and conversations, confidential conversations with both the NGO side and with the financial sector side, so that you kind of understand what the stumbling blocks are and what's kind of realistic in the shorter and longer term. So that's how I'd go about a project like that. Really would be trying to build up those relationships and that trust with the key people in the financial sector, while also really understanding from the NGO side what their priorities, what do they want to achieve, and then trying to put together, in this case, we put together a guide with the WWF that kind of brings up the ambition for the financial sector, says this is why we think this is important, this is why we think that you should act. And these are maybe some of the more straightforward ways that you could act, and these are some of the more ambitious, so that you can provide a way forward both for institutions that are quite advanced and very ambitious on these kinds of topics, and for ones that might be just kind of starting their journey.
Great. So you kind of acted as a bit of an intermediary there between the NGO and the financial institution.
Exactly.
Yeah. Amazing. And I know you also have done some work with United Nations environment programs. This is again on the environment side of things, around insurance and plastic pollution. So this really took my interest when I was reading about that, and I'm sure a lot of our audience in the financial space would also be keen to hear exactly what that project was and some of the outcomes.
Sure. So I have to say that this project turned me into a real advocate about plastics, and certainly a person who's quite scared about plastics, because I think it's a topic that you think you kind of think, yeah, it's a real worry because there's so much plastic rubbish being built up. But as you start to look into the evidence, you realize how really scary the impact of plastics is. There's a lot really that we actually still don't understand about the impact a lot of the chemicals and the compounds in plastics are having. And really, in nature, in our food production, in our own bodies, you and I and everyone, we're all consuming huge amounts of these broken down microplastics. And people who work directly with plastics are also coming into contact with a great deal of plastics. And this is having all kinds of consequences on reproductive health, has implications for cancer, really serious concerns around health, around our oceans too. Our oceans are full of plastic, which is killing off wildlife in the oceans, but also making fishing extremely difficult. So really, it's like a topic that you enter and you start to realize, wow, this is a really, really serious threat. And really our goal with this project was to say that insurance should be actors in this. And why maybe did we focus on insurers, or why are insurers relevant? I think for two reasons. Insurers have a huge role as financial sector actors. When insurers underwrite a project, they allow that project to go ahead, right? So, as we've seen, as insurers start to pull out of coal, which is something we've already seen happening, fewer and fewer insurers are willing to underwrite coal. That has a real impact on the ability of companies to set up new coal projects, for example. So they are a powerful actor. And secondly, risk is what insurers do. That's what they know. That's what their business is. So when we have a big and difficult to understand risk, like, insurers are ideal partners. And so what we did in this project is we mapped out the risks that, scientists are seeing in plastics across the business that insurers do and across the asset classes that insurers invest in, to see where we could highlight for insurers how some of these emerging risks around plastics are going to affect their business. And we saw that this was particularly important for health insurance because of the important health implications of plastics, for marine insurance, because increasingly, marine insurers are telling us plastics causing huge damage to boats, and we're underwriting boats that are getting damaged by plastic litter in the sea. And also liability, because the liability risks around plastics are huge, and whenever you have a large risk that we don't really understand, that's absolutely everywhere, like plastics are, we've got to be worrying about liability. And I heard several times from people who are real experts on this that plastics could be something like the next asbestos. It's a very widespread risk that we don't understand, that everybody's coming into contact to, and the kind of liability claims could be very enormous. So we did this mapping, we spoke to lots of insurers, we spoke to kind of NGO and civil society, again the same kind of pattern that I was describing to you before. And we came up with a set of guidelines that could be just an initial idea for insurers as to where they could play an active role in actually tackling plastic pollution. And this was things from, for example, like I mentioned, they're the experts in risk. How can they be including these kind of plastic pollution risks into their risk modeling? Also, for example, when you have car insurance and then you have a damage to your car, you go to get your car repaired, how can insurers make sure that as little as possible unnecessary plastic is used in your car repair, and the plastic that you use is recyclable? Insurers have quite a strong role there. And it's not just car insurance, other kinds of insurance where they're responsible for ensuring the repairs happen. And even, where can insurers play a really active role in providing insurance coverage? For example, when tourist areas experience these big influxes of plastic litter, and it's often not from the area. You might see, beautiful beaches in Thailand, and suddenly for a month, because of the way the water flows, they're just inundated with plastic litter. And so we were speaking with some insurers about the possibility of setting up a kind of insurance policy for a city or for a large tourism centres, hotels and so on, that would ensure them to do huge cleanup efforts whenever that happened. So insurers can really kind of come at this from lots of different ways of risk management, investors, underwriters. So we as part of this project, we saw them as really kind of powerful actors in addressing this really, really worrying global problem.
Absolutely. That's so interesting. And what was the reaction from insurers when you mentioned around the, let's say for the tourist center, plastic gets washed onto the beach?
Yeah.
What were some of the reactions that you had from insurance companies when you pitched that idea?
I think that increasingly the kind of more innovative insurers are really open to this kind of idea. So they're trying to see how they can play an active role in dealing with climate related and kind of environmental problems when they occur. So this is something that kind of some of the insurers are quite excited about, were quite interested in. As far as I know, this product doesn't exist yet, but I think that there is quite a lot of interest in them playing this kind of role. Maybe where they're a little like a bit more reluctance is seeing plastic more kind of across their portfolio and the risk of it, because this relates a little bit to what I mentioned to you before, that the scope is increasing so much. And you have to think about the fact that these financial institutions usually have a team, maybe a sustainability team that's responsible for this. And, that's only a certain number of people. They have, specialized knowledge in the areas they have specialized knowledge. And sometimes they feel like, oh, you're just giving me another topic. I don't know if I have the resources. I don't have the people to tackle this. So there's a kind of push and pull as the, civil society puts up the ambition, tells them they need to be thinking about new things. And then the financial institutions need to build up their capacity. They need to adapt. They need to be ready, develop new policies, develop new standards to respond to these kinds of issues. So there's always a bit of push and pull when you bring these issues, certainly to the institutions.
For sure. And you mentioned about the sustainability team in a financial institution. And of course, that's a small percentage of the total workforce, right? So, for ESG principles and to bridge the ESG gap, do you find there is a knowledge gap or capacity building challenges within the staff, within the workforce of financial institutions, or is it still the idea that anything around sustainability, hand it over to this team here?
Yeah, it can be, and sometimes you're lucky to have a well-staffed sustainability team. In some companies it's a person, in some companies there isn't a person. It's sort of a vague responsibility of, it could be linked to corporate communications sometimes, corporate communications and ESG or something like that, where companies are really still just seeing it as a reputational issue. Certainly the bigger companies that are maybe more aggressive or more aligned on this issue, or are based in countries where they're getting more pressure on this issue, and particularly in many European countries, do tend to have, they might have different wording for it, but some kind of a sustainability team or a sort of ESG focused team, who do really important work. But what you say is absolutely true. Really, for this kind of work to be effective, there needs to be capacity on ESG issues at all kinds of levels. And the technical people in the organization, the people making the decisions to make an investment or underwrite a risk, whatever it might be, really need to have a certain level of understanding of these issues. And that is a big challenge. And it's something where I think huge efforts have been made around climate, because that's been the sort of key, rightfully, a key issue in recent years. But there's much less, if you want to talk about something like plastics, there's a lot less capacity, there's a lot less understanding within the organization. And also, I think it really matters how high up the interest and the real commitment to these issues go. Whether the CEO, does the chief risk officer see this as an existential threat to the company or not? And that's a big question, because if they do, and they really see the importance of this, and not only the threat, the opportunity as well in being very advanced on these issues, then a lot can be done. But if it sort of gets pushed down to a specific team and the kind of emphasis isn't really there at the top, that can be very difficult, very frustrating actually for people who are working in those teams.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because there needs to be capacity at those that are making day-to-day decisions as well.
Yeah,
But it's all about what happens at the top.
absolutely.
So, where do you see this going? Where do you see the future for? Maybe it's
Yeah,
specific, or insurers versus banks. But in the next few years,
yeah.
what do you see changing?
I think that's a really difficult decision, a really difficult question, because there's such a level of unpredictability. I suppose, the timing that we have, especially if we think about the E of the ESG and the environmental issues, the amount of time we have left to make meaningful change is really, limited. And so, in the next 5 years, we need to see huge changes. And I hope that those come about. I hope that, we're going to look back in 5 years and say this was the time when these issues came about. And I think it's certainly possible. There's a lot of unpredictability in the financial system, right? So, if we see some kind of a crisis in the next few years within the financial system, what might that mean? Might that mean that people pull back on ESG issues because they just, desperate to get things back on their feet from a kind of day-to-day perspective? Or will it be a realization as we hit a crisis that actually this kind of way of doing finance is totally unsustainable, and actually we need to take these issues much more seriously? I think what we're seeing at the moment is a bit of a pull ahead from certain institutions and then a lot of lagging from others. And that's a serious problem because we really need everyone up there. So I hope that we can also have a push to help those who are still kind of low down, at the beginnings of this journey, to move very quickly. And I think this can't all be done by this can't all be led by the financial institutions. Actually, I believe we need government interventions, policy changes to force this to move more quickly, because there's really important initiatives are going on within the sector, but they're also responding to the environment around them. And really that needs to be pushed to go much more quickly, I believe. So, it's a bit circular. The financial sector also has their level of ambition and readiness has an impact on governments' willingness to move more quickly. So I think we really need both to increase the pace, but it is quite, I think there's a high level of unpredictability in what could happen in the next
Sure. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation there with,
yeah,
both sides can influence each other. Mm-hmm. But I understand that there is some kind of ESG leaderboards and ESG rankings for different financial institutions. Are those publicly available?
I believe that certain are. I'm afraid I don't have a lot of knowledge about that. There's certainly, I know certain ones that are specific to certain issues. So there's certain kind of certifications that companies, financial institutions, portfolios can get, as to be green or to be, more responsible from a water perspective, for example. I know them better when they're kind of issue specific. I'm not sure in a kind of overall sense.
Yeah, no problem. So for viewers on YouTube, you can see Alice's social media handles running down the bottom of the screen. And for those listening in audio, you can see them in the show notes. So Alice, if someone wants to learn more about your work or the work of Three Fin Consulting, how can they find you? Yeah,
so we're online at 3-fin.com is our website. You can also find us on LinkedIn and Twitter and so on. I think you'll share those, Jack. So
yeah, absolutely. So it's been a really interesting conversation. You've talked about some of your experience working with several NGOs, UN agencies, civil society organizations, financial institutions. So if you can share maybe some advice, if you had one page to write some advice in your own social impact journal for someone that may be just graduating and heading into this financial inclusion space or going into the financial sector and will be one of those that maybe have to learn more about ESG, what's your advice for them?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about this space is that you can come at it from a lot of different angles. So I think if this is something that you're interested in working in, I wouldn't underestimate the number of ways that you can get into it, because everybody I meet, Jack, I know that you come initially from kind of the more mainstream finance and tech space. I came originally from mainstream finance. My colleague who works for me comes from a political science background and came in through the Insurance Association. I know others that have worked in NGOs and then, seen the opportunities to target or to work with the financial sector and have moved in that way. So I think it's a really dynamic sector, and its very nature is that it's a crossover sector. It's kind of an area of work that requires engagement and understanding of the financial sector and of kind of social or environmental sectors. So I think that's quite exciting. And as a young person, it gives you lots of different ways in. You'll find that everybody you speak to who works in this sector has a slightly different story about how they came into it. And so I would be open to that. Maybe you don't need to work in the UN, or, sometimes people have very fixed ideas about where they need to be working to influence this space. And I think that's not true. There's lots of different ways in, and I would be, very open to that.
Great advice. Well, Alice, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast and sharing all of your experiences and insights. And let's see where the paradigm and the bridge between ESG and the financial sector goes in the coming months and year.
Thanks, Jack. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.